Hi, I am Edoardo Ballerini, and I am speaking today with Dominic Smith, who is the author of 6 novels, including The Last Painting of Sarah DeVos, which was a New York Times bestseller, and one of my personal favorites of the last few years, The Electric Hotel. But today we are here to talk about his latest, Return to Valetto. And I want to start with a quote by our mutual friend, Jess Walter, who says, "I was completely charmed and transported by Return to Valetto, Dominic Smith's smart, engaging novel about the secrets held within a dying Italian village. This terrific novel about loss and family and the weight of history is probably as close as I'll ever get to buying one of those picturesque Italian villas, and surely a wiser investment." I wholeheartedly agree. I loved this book. And so I want to turn it over to you immediately and say, how did this start? Where did this start? Where was the idea to come from?
Yeah. Thanks, Eduardo. I appreciate that. So this book sort of has two sources of inspiration. One is just my own fascination with all these dying towns in Italy. You know, there's I think about 2,500 little towns and villages all over Italy that are either sort of considered abandoned or on the verge of becoming abandoned. On various trips to Italy, I've been fascinated by that. I think there's about 2 million houses lying vacant. And so that was one source of inspiration, just wanting to understand, like, why is so much of Italy abandoned? And then the other thing was this story I heard that I didn't know about Italy during World War II, which was the story of sort of like these children who were sent south for safekeeping when the cities like Milan and Turin were being bombed. And
Yeah.
so they were sent, to little villages and sometimes villas all over central Italy, especially in Tuscany and Umbria. And I just didn't know that story. And I was sort of interested in the way that opened up storyline possibilities with the idea of these sort of refugee children moving around the country. And so the book really came out of like pulling on those two different threads over time.
It touched a very personal note with me because my grandfather is from Abruzzo, which is not too far, and my father was one of these World War II children that you talk about. He was born in Milan. My grandfather actually died in World War II, and so my father never met him. And while my father was never moved to one of these villas down further south, it was very personal to me. But what I felt more than anything was this theme of like sort of decay and loss that just went past just, the specifics of these villages and these children. And there was this broader theme that I kept feeling, that it's this time that we're living in as well, that there's this decay and loss. And there's this story of this effort to reclaim it, and who owns it. And is it this new person coming in, or is it the old family? And so I found it actually very current, even though it's what we call a historical novel.
Yeah, well, we had emailed about this, but I love your personal connection to this work, and I want to ask you more about that. But I think this theme of like decay. I mean, one of the things that really surprised me about my research in Italy and spending some time there is the way that Italians don't ever really let anything in their history go, right? And so you can be standing on a street corner in Rome and you can see 3 eras side by side of Italian history. You can see an Etruscan monument, you can see something from the Roman era, and you can still see something from the sort of fascist era.
Sure.
And this idea that you're sort of like the way that the past shows up in the present. And I think it is really interesting. And then I think when it comes to these ghost villages, from the outside, when we think of abandoned places, we often think of these ghost towns in the American West. And what was surprising to me is that many of these places are sort of what I think of as abandoned in plain sight, right? Some of them are not that remote. Sometimes there's a viable town just, a kilometer away. And so that sort of paradox, like the way that Italians like both live in the present are very sort of like pragmatic. Many of these places have been left because of the search for a better life or for jobs, but also this idea that those villages, their ancestral villages, they're never fully left behind. They feel this deep connection to that. And I really wanted to explore that sort of like duality in the book.
Well, this idea of history is something that Americans certainly don't have as close a grip on, because it's such a young country. And also, you know, in this country, we tend to sort of knock things down at the first chance to put something new up. But you're absolutely right. In Italy, you know, I always marvel that, you know, people were walking by ruins from thousands of years ago, and, you know, they're talking on a cell phone, which is very modern, and it all kind of works together. And they don't really think about like, oh, this is ancient and this is modern. Right. It's all part of this one big thing.
Yeah, no, exactly. And even in the town, so the town that Valetto is heavily based on in terms of its history.
And Valetto is fictional.
Yeah, Valetto is fictional, but it's really modeled on sort of like Civita di Bagnoregio, which is this sort of stunning hill town in central Italy that sits on this pedestal of volcanic rock, and the only way in and out of the town is on a footbridge. It's a really just stunning sort of landscape that's also in its own way sort of ravaged by earthquakes. There was a big one in 1695 when about a third of the town fell into the valley. But, you know, you walk across that footbridge and you feel like you're in this other time and world, but less than a kilometer away, there's grocery stores and there's people living their normal lives. And I think
the shopping mall, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like that's the sort of like the duality of Italy that I just, you know, I'm so fascinated by. And Italians, I feel like totally take it in their stride. Like they're not shocked by the juxtaposition. They're sort of like they're drowning in their own history in many ways.
Right. You mentioned the footbridge, which it's funny, the first time I came across it in the book, I had this vision, and I don't think this is quite what it is, and I understood it better later, of sort of like the bridge of San Luis Rey, this like very thin little thing that connects one side to the other, and that there's this sort of peril idea that when you're walking across it, the whole thing could collapse. But thematically, that might be, you know, might be more accurate, because there's a lot of this, even though you talk about the integration of like, you know, the town over and here, there's this idea that once you cross this bridge and you get to Valetto, you're in a very specific place. And a lot of things happen there that are not happening on the other side. And of course, without, you know, giving too much away, the two combine at the end. So you see that how the outside and the inside work together. But there's a lot of emotion that happens there.
Mm-hmm.
Did this come from something?
Sorry, the emotion?
Yeah, no, did this sort of, there's an emotional arc that happens in this book. You see this family, you see this sort of fight for their history, you see these other people coming in, and then there's, again, without giving too much away, there's this fantastic scene where, you know, this event that's being led up to happens, and we see these forces. What was the inspiration there?
Well, one of them was how many, so the, you know, the underbelly of the big event, we won't talk about too much, but the occasion for it is the grandmother's 100th birthday. And of course, Italy has, I think, more centenarians than anywhere in the world, except maybe Japan. So there's a lot of, like, you know, older people in Italy, and I was sort of interested in that. And I met some folks while I was traveling who were well into their late 90s and seemingly look like they could live forever. And I'm sort of interested in that. But like the emotional, I don't think I realized when I was writing the book that the bridge is a real metaphor, not just for the way in which these two worlds collide, but also a bridge between the narrator's present and his past, right? Because I mean, Valetto is this town where Hugh Fisher, the narrator, who's this American historian who specializes in these abandoned places, like this is where he sort of discovered his own sort of like soul as a historian, and where sort of like the first light bulb went off in these abandoned buildings in Valetto. And so it's the bridge to that. It's also in some ways the bridge to his emotional life, which is tied up so much of the book in him feeling sort of cut off from his present because of this grief that he's carrying for both his wife and his mother. And so Valetto, even though it is in its own weird way this time capsule, it's also the place where the past and the present collide. And it's in that collision that Hugh Fisher sort of, in some ways, becomes unstuck.
Right.
And I think that was certainly something that I was thinking about when I was sort of building Valetto, over the course of the novel.
Now, you write Hugh Fisher in the first person. So what was the choice there to set this novel?
Yeah, and it didn't always, it didn't actually start, I didn't know that first person was going to work. And Hugh Fisher is one of those characters who evolved. I always feel like with first person, it has to feel necessary. Like there's got to be a really compelling reason why this person is telling this story. And the challenge with Hugh as our narrator is almost like the burden of grief, right? It's like grief can often be this sort of static and sometimes passive predicament. And so how do you make a first person narrator who's compelling and engaging while also being true to their emotional life because of what they're experiencing? And in some ways, what I found is that, Hugh is a great observer, and he is sort of galvanized by all these larger than life personalities around him. So in some ways, by being a good and honest reporter on what he's seeing, he sort of gets to accumulate some of that, that dynamic quality in terms of what he observes.
Well, I as a narrator, and having recorded this, I love first person because it gives me a chance to essentially sort of be the character and play the part. I think of it more as like a monologue than, a narration. But you mentioned Hugh, he runs into all these fantastic characters, and there are many wonderful characters here, most of whom, except for Milo, I guess I would say, are women. And so is there something there that you want to talk about why you chose these sisters?
Well, one very obvious thing is that I have 3 older sisters. And yes, you found it.
Got it.
And they are all in their own way strong, resilient, willful, adventurous. And so when it came to writing about this sisterhood, I was definitely creating from scratch, but I could relate to the way that sibling dynamics, especially among women, just sort of like play out over time. And interestingly, the 3 sisters were sort of like the first thing that I really came to me early on in writing the novel, and they came to me almost enveloped in the villa. The villa was sort of like its own character because I really understood and some of my travels had sort of, delivered this a little bit, like these crumbling villas in Italy, they're often charming, but also ramshackle. And the way in which people repurpose them over time. And so this idea of the sisters carving out their own apartments in the villa over time, and they've each sort of become widows, was really interesting to me, in the way in which 3 characters are sort of a single character in a way in relationship to the villa, but also their own individual personality.
And is there a matriarchal figure in your life that you also drew upon?
Yeah, so my mother also, sort of when I was thinking about the character of Ida, the matriarch, my mother is someone who has had all these just incredible adventures and has ended up sort of like, when you look at her family history, she's descended from Scots people who first immigrated to the US, were in a shipwreck off the coast of New Orleans, continued on, settled in Kentucky, and then for reasons we don't really understand, decided they didn't like it, went back to Scotland, and then emigrated to Australia, to Queensland several years later. And I sort of love this idea of just the uncanniness of where people's families end up. I mean, sort of like, interested in that you mentioned your grandfather and that you hadn't met him, but you feel this connection to the storyline and to Italy. And I think we talked a little bit about the rendering of the train station in Milan, and that he worked on that. I mean, I'm just curious to know your own when you have a personal connection to the world of a book, does it change the way you sort of perform it, or is it just sort of like an added layer that sort of sits with you as you begin?
Yeah, I would say it's an added layer. One of the things I try not to do is impose myself onto a work. My job as the narrator is to deliver what the author has written. But you mentioned this idea of the sort of international kind of forces that are sort of behind the scenes, which I thought was very interesting as well. So we have this tiny little village. It's obviously in Italy, and these people have been here for a long time, but they are informed by a long history that precedes the time we see them, of all these travels. And then they come into this situation where they're forced to help, save these people in a situation that was not of their making, which I also found very interesting. That again, this sort of larger theme. We talked about sort of decay and loss, and that extends beyond Valetto and Italy. This idea of this kind of internationalism, of this interconnectedness between continents and countries and people who find themselves in these situations. Now, what is your background? Where did you grow up, and where did you?
Yeah, so I grew up in Australia.
Right.
My father was American. My mother's Australian. And there, I was conscious of this growing up. They met on a beach in New Guinea while my dad was like in the U.S. Air Force, and sort of that idea of just people. Like, I've always had this sense of like people in my family living in far-flung places, but also just the unlikeliness of where people end up through these different threads of history. And when I was in Italy, I just remember the way that physically sort of was really brought home is that often in these abandoned towns or nearly abandoned towns, there'll be houses that have been left behind by people who now live on an entirely different continent, right? And so what's amazing is that often these houses are left with all the furniture in them, the doors unlocked. If a neighbor needs something out of the house that nobody's lived in for decades, they'll just go in and grab whatever they need, right? And that's sort of like, that really brings home, I think, for Italy, the sort of like just the diaspora over time. Like, there's been so many different generations of Italians who've migrated all over the world, from Melbourne to Brooklyn to London to everywhere. And that's
we think
part of the legacy of these places.
Sorry to interrupt. No, but we think of Italy as a country that sends people out, right? Not so much as a country that takes people in, although that has certainly been the case more and more in the last generation or so. But I love this idea that these people who, this family is very well established. They've been there for generations. They have this house. They actually came from somewhere else.
That's right.
Which I loved. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of those stories, I'm often drawn to what I think of as the gaps and the silences of history, and why I so often write about historical context. And the story that for me, like, really connected Italy to Australia was this sort of just bizarre story of, in the 19th century, this French nobleman who was really a con man, the Marquis de Ray, essentially created this sort of phantom paradise off the coast of New Guinea, where he sold many Italians who were struggling a voyage on this ship. And they sailed out to this island in New Guinea. Of course, they get there and it's, a fool's paradise. There's nothing there. It's just basically jungle. And then a couple hundred Italians on that voyage end up being rescued, and they sail to Sydney, and they settle there briefly before starting this little community on the north coast of New South Wales called New Italy. And the town is not there anymore, but there are many families who are still descended from that sort of original sort of colony. And that's one of those examples of like, you couldn't make that up. It wouldn't seem believable. But so in the novel, Ida Serafino, the matriarch, is descended from someone who was on that voyage. So that's how she sort of landed in Australia. Australia has a lot of Italians over time. And then she goes back to Italy in the 1920s as a sort of assistant to a governess. And that's where she meets Aldo Serafino. And that's sort of how the two family lineages come together.
Yeah. So what you just described, is that when you hear an idea like that, is that a potential future project?
I don't think so, although I've thought about it. I have thought and done quite a bit of research on that voyage. So far, it hasn't sort of moved at the critical mass required to spend several years pursuing a novel on it. But
because I mean, this historical fiction is, it takes, dare I say, more time and research than if you just sat down and said, I'm going to make something up whole cloth, right?
Yeah, but to be, fair, it's also, for me, like the research, if I could just do the research and not write the novel and someone would pay me to do it, I might. Because it's so fun. And especially with a book like this, I mean, who doesn't want to I mean, not everyone, including my wife, wanted to travel to abandoned places in Italy, but still, it was, doing the research is where my books sort of come to life. And without that, without like interviewing real people, whether it's, art restoration experts or people in these dwindling villages, like the books don't really have a life without that.
And how often do you feel like you know where something is headed, and then you run into a piece of research or you do an interview and it completely reroutes the story?
Oh, all the time. All the time. I mean, and I was lucky enough to have you as a narrator on the last painting of Sarah de Vos, where there's a little, in the opening chapter, there's this this sort of like rent-a-beat cocktail party that happens. And that story was something that I discovered in the archives, like in the Village Voice. Someone had basically run this ad for like rent a beat for your next, soiree. And they did it as a prank, but it was so successful that they ended up turning it into a legitimate business. And so that was just so compelling that I had to find a way for it to organically fit in the novel. But I'd say generally where I think a book is going to go and where it actually ends up is always, quite different.
So then you have the research, which might divert you, and then you have the characters themselves, which must develop in your mind over time as you're writing. And do they kind of take over the narrative? Do they sort of surprise you and say, oh, well, this is the natural thing for them to say or do?
Yeah. And I was thinking about this because, I was thinking about how that works and sort of the connection to what you do as an actor, because I always think about sort of the Flannery O'Connor idea of like the mystery of personality, right? And it's this idea that, there's a core of consistency in characters, but where all the good stuff is in some ways in the things that will surprise you, right? And sort of like that inconsistency, like, and I think when following a cast of characters across a novel, I'm always attuned to, what feels right and true to their moment and their character, but also where's the possibility of surprise. And I feel like ultimately it's the process of writing and sort of following them and paying attention to what's working for them and what's working on the page that you ultimately find the story and the plot.
Right.
And that's never quite what you think it is in the beginning. I don't think you can get there without the process.
Right. Unless you're writing a memoir, I suppose, where the A to B, right? But that's a very different thing. And then I suppose at some moments there might be some sort of disappointment in the sense that you want it to go somewhere. You have this sort of idea like, oh, I'm going to get them to this place. And then you realize that that's actually not natural. That's actually not organic to the story. And we can't do that.
It doesn't work. And I wonder if that happens to you as an actor. Like, do you ever sort of have an idea of a character or even the way of telling a story that ultimately doesn't quite come together because it's just not, the indicators aren't there.
Yeah, I mean, again, my job really is to follow what is written and to really stay away from imposing myself. It becomes tempting in moments to say, I would love to do this way, right? Yeah. Or, here's a great voice or something, but it's not right for it. And so you have to follow the cues and clues that are laid out before you. As I said earlier, this idea of, the first person, which is my favorite. The other thing I really enjoy, to be perfectly honest, is a book that has multiple characters, but not thousands of them. I feel like it really focuses a reader or a listener, right? Yeah. Sometimes you get these books where people are just arriving left and right, and they're going in and out, and they maybe just sort of pop in for a moment or two. But what we have in Valetto is a very, it's a small little community, and it's a small cast of characters.
But I also want to ask you, because you're so good at accents, and in my work, there's often people who have blended backgrounds, right? Like in this book, we've got an Anglo-Italian, family of women.
Right.
You've got older generation of, quote unquote, like pure and sort of native Italians.
Right.
And so like how, and like I was listening to the audiobook. You did such a great job of sort of like bringing almost a slightly different accent and voice to every character based on sort of what we know of them. And I want to ask you, like, how do you do that? Like, do you prepare for that?
I do. Certainly, I make some choices beforehand. In your novel, what was interesting is, as we've discussed, that these characters, they've been in Italy for a long time, but they come from other places. And so I remember having to make this decision of like, how Italian are they at this point? Ultimately, I decided, especially with Ida, that because she'd been there for so long, that she would essentially just at this point be Italian. And one thing I try to do is draw on people that I know in my own life. And, like yourself, I'm somewhat international, and I know people who've gone abroad. I know people who've moved to the States, and I always find it fascinating to listen to their accents. Like some people, they can have been in the United States for 50 years, 60 years, and they have just never shed their original accent, which is amazing to me. Others, you would have no idea that they had come from somewhere else. My thinking was, because of the historical element of it, and because there would have been this great isolation, meaning they wouldn't have been exposed to a lot of Australian or English or American media the way we are now, that they really would have lived in this bubble of Italy and become very Italian. But yes, you have to make these decisions early on. And so in this case, I went with the sort of stronger Italian than anything else.
Have you always been attuned to accents in that way? Is that something that you sort of grew up with?
Well, let's see. My father's Italian, my mother's American. They're both academics, and they would often have these international cast of characters over for dinner parties. And so I grew up between New York and Milan, Italy. And so I kind of always grew up with these sounds and these different voices and these different accents all around me. I remember, there'd be a dinner party when I was a kid, and there'd be, there's a German, there's a French, there's a Brit, there's, a couple of Italians, there's some Americans. And it all just sort of made sense to me. That was the swirl of voices and sounds. So I benefit greatly from that. And then my father is a linguist, so we talked about language a lot. And we talked about sounds and words, and that's essentially my background. So I was sort of unwittingly being trained for this. I didn't know it at the time.
And how have you, when you look back on your sort of narration career in audiobooks, do you feel like there's has it changed over time, the way you approach reading a book?
Yeah, it's funny. When I first started out, I had no idea what I was doing, and I just sort of jumped in, and luckily I did something right, and it kind of worked out. Then I went through a period, I confess, where I became very self-conscious, and I started thinking, oh, I'm doing everything wrong, and what's going on here? Now I'm in my about 10th or 12th year of doing this, and I've found a place to kind of let go and trust. And so I've learned to read the cues in the text and follow it and trust that my instincts will work out. Yeah. But like any craft, as a writer, you must have experienced this too. You start out, you say, I don't know how this works. I don't know what I'm doing. I just have a story to tell.
Yeah.
Then all of a sudden you get some reviews and you get some feedback and you think, oh my God, I've got to adjust for this and that. Yeah. And then at some point you kind of let go of that.
No, I think you do. I think you have to, or you won't keep doing it. Right. Because I think if you carry around all those voices of how you could have done it differently, right. I think it's really interesting the way in which, and maybe this comes up for actors as well, like at a certain point, you are the writer you are. That doesn't mean you don't want to always try to reinvent yourself, find new territory, tell new stories. But I'm often just sort of one of the things that I use in my own writing process is just to be naturally suspicious of things that I think I do well. It's almost like, oh, I see you're doing that little thing that you're fond of. Is that the right choice, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think we can become so habituated to that. But yeah, I mean, it's, both these things I think are very humbling in that there's only so much you can bring to the project. Right. Much of it is sort of set by some limitations, and yet you're always trying to break those limitations, right, in order to make it interesting and new.
Right. Do you have certain things though that you do bring from novel to novel?
I tend to. I mean, I'm interested in sort of like what I think of as like congested storylines, right? Mm-hmm. I like there to be a lot going on because I like the puzzle of trying to navigate a path through that. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's multiple storylines, sometimes it's not too big a cast of characters, but I want following one character through a fairly, a set of encounters with one other person is not the sort of storyline that galvanizes me as a writer. Mm-hmm. I tend to like complicated, layered situations and then trying to, hack my way through the bushes.
But what I liked so much about Return to Valetto is that it is this layered, complicated thing, but it's also limited in, I don't mean limited, that's the wrong word. It's also contained within this very small world. Yeah. So you feel like you can really be in this world. You can really live in this world with these characters. Yeah. And again, this idea that once you cross the bridge, like right, you're in, right?
That's, yeah. And that's sort of the experience I had of like walking across this bridge in Civita di Bagnoregio and walking through this Etruscan archway that's 1,000 years old. Right. And you walk into this piazza that's surrounded by these medieval stone houses, and there's a church with a 12th century bell tower, and then there's the valley, because of the geology, just drops away on all sides. It's almost like you're in this island that's just jutting up from the middle of the valley, and it felt very almost like a crucible, or an arena. Like right. it was primed for drama in its own way. And obviously the backdrop of that drama is its seismology, is the fact that it's sort of held on against all the odds over the centuries. And so finding sometimes a way to, add to this congested sort of like many things going on is like, how can you contain it to add pressure? Yeah. Is an interesting question.
Not a lot of people know this about Italy, but there are earthquakes there all the time. It's not really an area of the world we necessarily think about that, but probably doesn't get a lot of press here in the United States anyway. But this idea that these earthquakes have come along and destroyed so much of it, and yet there's still so much of it standing.
Yeah, and also many of the towns that I visited have had a second act after a big earthquake. I mean, this town of Bussana Vecchia, which was, abandoned in the 19th century after a big earthquake, and then sort of repopulated when a band of musicians and artists from really all over the world sort of started out as squatters in the town that was mostly ruins, and then sort of slowly rebuilt it and eventually got electricity brought in from the nearby municipality. And now if you visit it, it's not that it's less seismically at risk today. It's just that the last big earthquake was so long ago that people are like, well, it's still a nice place to live.
It's like people in Southern California. You keep telling them, you know, this is going to go.
Exactly. And I live in Seattle, where all the reports are is like, if the Juan de Fuca big fault line goes, like Seattle's in trouble, and yet it's stunning up here despite the weather. And so we sort of, in a way, you live with a sort of magical thinking about it. You're like, okay, that could happen, but it sure is nice for right now.
Well, let's hope that the earth does not give way under our feet anytime soon. But I think we're running out of time here. Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, this is wonderful, and thank you for an amazing reading and performance, and thank you for the really generous conversation.
Oh, my pleasure. I truly adored this book. As I said at the top, there's a personal element to it that came in, but also it's just a gorgeous piece of writing. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.